150 billion tonnes of carbon emitted in the atmosphere since those barbaric days of the 1970s when you only had one blade. So I don't want to blame it all on them, but this illustration hopefully gives a wee insight to what's happened in capitalist production. Moving on to more the global levels, what can capitalism do? Talked a little bit about individuals, some of the national developments, regulations and taxation and such like. But of course, carbon dioxide molecules bob around in the air, they don't respect national boundaries. It's a problem that has to be dealt with globally. So what's happening at the global level? Well, what we see is carbon dioxide molecules, carbon dioxide emissions, becoming just another pawn, just another bargaining token in the global geopolitical battleground, in the ongoing battle between nations and trading blocs and individual states. Since the Kyoto Agreement was signed off in 1997, global emissions have increased by a further quarter. As we know, recently the US is now coming to the table, albeit reluctantly. The points of contention here being, for example, that the US doesn't want to sign up to it unless their biggest economic rival in the future, China, has to. If the US is going to be handicapped in terms of its economic growth in the future, they want to make damn sure that China is as well. China counters by saying, well, wait a minute, all of that CO2 in the air came from you to start with. So again, where do you draw the baseline? How do you pull together an agreement when you have all these competing influences, nations, companies, industrial sectors, all trying to protect their market and, in fact, increase their market share, if possible, during this shift from non-renewable to renewable economies. An example of this problem was the Guardian published last week. The Gardner reported that the UK is attempting to make its investment in renewable projects overseas count in terms of the UK's contribution. So again, that's up for debate. Who takes the credit for that? Is it the people who invested in it, or is it where the plant is actually built? So there's all these sorts of debates and arguments to be fought over, affecting every single inch of industrial production and distribution. And the other big problem that I would see in terms of relying on capitalism to solve this problem is that it's all very well having legislation and regulations and all the rest of it, carbon offsetting and these things. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to shift the market into a specific direction. And the market doesn't take kindly to being told which way to go. I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm just saying it doesn't take kindly to it. There's a couple of ways of looking at this. Now, in the Al Gore film, An Inconvenient Truth, that many of you I'm sure will have seen, the biggest laugh, at least in the cinema that I saw it in, isn't something that Al Gore says, but a quote that he uses from a guy called Upton Sinclair, who I'm sure many of you will know more about than me. I understand that he was a Communist Party of the US, journalist and leader, in fact, I think, in the 1930s. Al Gore, for some reason, I omitted to mention that in this film, it might not have gone down too well in the US. But we in the SPGB, we're not fans, certainly, of the so-called communist parties around the world, but I know a good quote when I see one, and it is a good quote. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Now, at face value, the quote can be seen as an indictment of individual greed, deliberately ignoring something just because your salary depends on it. But I would broaden it and extend its relevance beyond the individual and to society at large, which I presume was Upton Sinclair's actual intent behind the quote. I don't know the context of the quote, I must admit. So I would extend it to the logic of capitalism, in fact. There are laws and statutes and regulations prohibiting you from using children in factories or putting them up chimneys, that prohibits you from polluting rivers or from killing workers in your workplace. But there's no law that says an employer must make a profit. There's no delivery of profits to shareholders regulations. There's no Production for Profit Act 1974. And the reason for that? Because the whole system is already predicated on that to start with. That's what it's based on. Production for profit and delivery of that surplus to shareholders is the first and last of capitalism. So I would broaden this quote. It's not so much a criticism of human foibles as a criticism of economic circumstances. And I would, in this context, amend it to say it's hard to reform capitalism if the reform will endanger profit. Maybe not quite so pithy as Upton Sinclair's quote, but certainly true. Regulatory history is littered with examples of well-meaning pieces of legislation which were evaded, watered down, circumvented, or ignored. And the big problem with relying on regulation to mitigate CO2 emissions is that in order to make it work, you're going to have an army of inspectors and agencies and policemen and certification bodies and auditors to provide some sort of veneer of confidence in the market, whether it's the carbon offsetting market or the emissions trading market. After all, at the end of the day, as long as you have capitalism, there will be incentives to cheat. Now you all know you can buy little gizmos that you can put on your electricity meter, a wee magnet that slows it down. So you pay less in your electricity meter. It doesn't mean you're using less electricity, but you're paying less. In fact, Scottish Power found out one of their customers was cheating them when every quarter they found that they actually owed this guy money. Bigger and bigger magnets, and it wasn't just slowing down, it was just going into reverse. Now this is what people do for their own energy budgets and their own energy bills, because it's much the same criteria that's used for a lot of the CO2 at the moment, the assessment of what somebody's emissions are. You're not actually going into a chimney stack and measuring what CO2 is going up a chimney stack. That's the job I do, by the way, is measure things coming out of chimneys. And but we're not asked to look at CO2. You measure it by looking at a company's utility bills, and you work out from that. So I'm not convinced that there's not going to be a lot of people slowing down their electricity meter. Maybe I'm just being cynical. But there's an incentive to cheat. You can bet people are going to be cheating. Last week the papers exposed a biofuel scam, whereby people were taking biofuel, and I think they were selling over to the US, and again it registered as being a biofuel over there and bringing it back over. Some sort of complex arrangement that I didn't, to be honest, read the whole article, as you can probably guess. But this was meant to be a green product, but in actual fact it's making this extra trip of thousands of miles by tanker so that it is classed as a biofuel and can be sold as a premium, at a premium as such. But then again, maybe I'm being cynical about this. Maybe with the right politicians in place, with the right leaders, we can circumvent these problems, and they can put their heads together. This is the G8, I think, although there's more than 8 of them, I think. Yeah. Maybe we should have confidence that with the immense importance of this subject, that our leaders will actually be able to do something about it and respond to the pressure from the people of the world on this issue. But then again, look at them one at a time. Do you really trust these people? There's Putin. That's him actually at a negotiation table, taking his shirt off, bare chested. That's the one I meant, Sarkozy. And my favourite one, the reason when you get off the internet, Tony Blair bringing peace to the Middle East there. And he just recently been announced as the High Regent who's going to be overlooking the global leaders and knocking their heads together to try and make this thing work. However, if you do look at the CV, it doesn't make very good reading. He did promise to eradicate child poverty in the UK during his term of office, and he hasn't managed to do that. he was going to bring peace and security to Iraq. I think that's not happened yet. He's going to sort out a peace process in the Middle East. A little bit more work to be done on that, perhaps. But now he's got a free Tuesday afternoon every other week to deal with global warming. So maybe we should have a bit more faith that this will work. And some people would say, surely with the immensity of this problem, our leaders will respond to humanity's cries that something needs to be done about global warming. Well, I would compare this with the universal revulsion in opposition to two other global social problems that, by coincidence, Glenn mentioned earlier on, that we can't demarcate from global warming: war and global poverty. I don't have time or space to go into these subjects in any detail. Suffice to say that Sir Nicholas Stern, when he said climate change was the biggest example of market failure, well, I'd be inclined to disagree with that. The fact that we have global poverty, 30,000 people starving to death every day, apparently, that strikes me as being a bit of a market failure and probably will dwarf the impact of global warming in years to come. But of course that doesn't register on the market system. Do they say, well, the market isn't working in Africa, there's no market there, so it's nothing to do with us? I think our charge would be that the market system claims to be the most efficient means of matching supply with demand. We would say then it's clearly failing the starving and the malnourished of the world. Capitalism gives us many things. It creates new markets every day, not just carbon offsetting, but markets in derivatives, futures, hedge funds. Don't ask me about this, I don't know what they actually mean. But they create these sort of virtual markets. While there's no actually markets for people like this, the famous Kevin Carter picture from the Sudan 20 years ago. So the track record for capitalism on global issues is not a good one. They haven't dealt with war, and they haven't dealt with global poverty. Should we really have confidence that we're going to be able to deal with global warming? Now, it's at this stage that I was going to come on to talk about socialism, and it's 12 minutes to 5.
No, 12 minutes to 4.
Is that not?
It's 4.
Is it 4?
Yeah, 12 minutes to 4. Yeah.
So we have got an hour on top of this.
Half of that now, yeah.
Right, that's fine. I was going to say, I want 12 minutes of discussion at least. So I'll come on to the socialism bit then. That's good. Right. Yeah, so just to finish off on that point, first of all, it's tempting to get carried away with the sort of compelling global warming storyline, an unknown danger lurking somewhere in the future, supposedly. But I think it's also easy to oversee that today, in a relatively stable climate, or over the last few decades in a relatively stable climate, millions of people have died needlessly from hunger in a world that could actually feed them. So let's maybe keep things in some sort of perspective. Probably global warming is not an issue for a large minority of the population of the world whose expected lifetime is maybe 30 or 40 years. But it's not a competition. We're not trying to rank what's the most important issue or not. What we're trying to do is actually put things into perspective. From a socialist point of view, actually try and see the common links between these social problems, that you can't really deal with one and ignore the others. Okay, so what could socialism do? So to summarise so far, the SPGB doesn't like capitalism very much. Hopefully you've got that message. But that's the easy bit, criticising a system. And the question is asked, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to put in its place? And the first response that I should say to that question, question I asked myself, is that socialists won't really be doing anything. It won't be up to us. It won't be up to the SPGB. It won't be up to me and the chairman sitting in a hall in Holborn dictating what socialism is going to be like. Socialism must be the collective effort of a politically aware majority of humanity. And as long as you don't get away from that starting point, then a lot of other things hopefully slot in. So what might socialism be like, and would it be able to meet the challenge of global warming? One of the things I was wanting to do this talk, I decided just to drop it earlier on just because of time reasons, was to, I did mention actually in part, contrasting the problem of global warming and how we got into that problem, contrasting that with the lifeline that scientists have up to point given us in terms of understanding of the problem. This lifeline they've given us over a very, very short period of time. And that's a scientific approach. And socialists try at least to use a similar approach if we can, by which I mean a systematic approach, a thorough approach, primarily trying to identify the level at which a problem lies, to get down to the right explanatory level. That's what the scientists, the physical scientists have done with global warming. So when you might be an oceanographer looking at corals for your own interest for years and years, and understanding the processes and how they get bleached by acids and such like. And then when an atmospheric scientist comes along to you and says, by the way, increased CO2 dissolution into the oceans, what's that going to do to the corals? You're able to answer them because you've actually got down to the right level of understanding of the physical world. And I guess what we would say is we should be doing that same sort of thing in terms of our understanding of the political world, or the economic world, getting down to the right explanatory level. Because what you do find is when you get down to the right explanatory level, you identify what things are wrong. It doesn't just answer one problem like global warming, it does start to answer a whole host of other social problems as well. Because it can be daunting when you hear the socialist case at first. You think, my goodness, that sounds pretty daunting. But bear in mind just what the potential is, what power it actually will give us, that level of understanding. So what actually is the socialist case then? We would argue that the problem doesn't lie at the level of the individual consumer, but it lies in the nature of society, specifically how we organise production and distribution of wealth. We'd argue that the real motor behind production is the drive for profit. It's not to satisfy human needs, though that may often occur as a byproduct. The real function, the real drive is production for sale on the market with a view to making a profit. And why is this necessary? Because the profit is retained by the owners of the means of producing that wealth, and it's retained by them with the result that they can be rich without actually having to do any work themselves. A bit like Glenn's industrialist talking to the fishermen. But in order to break that cycle, production for profit, sold on a market, profit realised, profit taken by a minority, profit invested to employ more people, to make more stuff, to realise a profit and so on. In order to break that cycle, you have to challenge a whole host of things. You have to get down to a certain fundamental level. You have to challenge not just waste and pollution. You can't just pick on Bush or Ryanair or EasyJet. See, it's bad when your laptop goes to sleep. Tell you something. You can't just challenge these things. You have to look a bit deeper. You have to remove production for profit. And you can't do that without removing its cause, which is class monopoly over ownership and control of the means of producing the wealth. And to remove that, you'll have to remove also the means, the mechanism that the economy uses to value things, whether it's commodities or work, labour. So that means removing prices, wages and money. And just in case that isn't off-putting enough, this change, this revolutionary change, can't be localised. Glenn mentioned this as well. It really has to be achieved as part of a global movement. Now, when I first heard that case, many years ago, I thought, what a load of utopian rubbish. In fact, the second time I heard it, I still thought it was utopian rubbish. It took a few times for it to sink in. You have to keep a few balls in the air, as it were. Because politically we're so used to dealing with problems one at a time. Let's deal with that problem. Let's ban that, first of all. Let's stop that. Let's deal with this. There's a bit of a leap required to keep all these ideas in your head and envisage how socialism could be, identify that it can address so many of the social problems that bedevil capitalism. So I've certainly got no illusions that the case for genuine socialism is a daunting one. And it also begs as many questions as it answers. Questions that people may want to bring up during the question time. I won't be answering these questions, but who will do the dirty work? That's a common question. Why won't people take more than they need from the common store? That's a common question also. Won't there be chaos without the market guiding production and distribution? So I won't be addressing these questions, but we can pick up on these later if anybody wants to. So socialism, in summary, would be a moneyless, wageless, classless and stateless world community. In many ways, that's the only difference from capitalism. The rest of it won't change that much. That's a joke, by the way. What changes are the... It's bad news when you have to tell people that's a joke. What changes there would be in the priorities for production. There'll be lots of changes, obviously, and we just don't know. They are unknown unknowns, aren't they? But certainly one important change, I think very important to this discussion, global warming, is in the changes in the priorities for production. And it's there that we can start to address why we think socialism can provide a pretty good response to the challenge of climate change. Now, there have been very, very few studies looking at structural waste inside capitalism. It's not a subject that wins research grants for obvious reasons. But the few assessments that there have been suggest that the extent of waste of labour inside capitalism is immense. When you strip away the useless jobs, essential to capitalism, but useless to socialism, when you strip away the useless jobs, the sheer scale of the waste starts to become apparent. I put a wee list here of just some examples of the types of economic activity, the types of jobs. I'm sure you've all seen these before, which are absolutely redundant within a socialist society. And I'll just flesh out a couple of these in a bit more detail. The defence industry, the military, is of course an immense consumer of labour and resources, and it has an immense impact on the environment in its own right. But it's not just the obvious waste of labour. The soldiers and such like. For every 100 people employed on an army base, there'll be another 4, 5, 6 people who are employed to maintain it, doing what you would normally think of as being socially useful jobs. Joiners, plumbers, electricians. Very useful jobs, but not if they're maintaining an RAF base. And what about military research? Apparently 50%, and don't ask me for the origin of this, I'll have to get back to you on that one, but it's a figure that I've heard for some time now. 50% of global R&D, research and development, is spent on military applications. So you could take all the scientists in the world, and half of them could go away and do something better inside a socialist society, rather than working on military applications. The research body Forrester Consultants published a report looking at innovation in the food industry? What proportion of research and development in that industry is genuinely novel, was the question they asked. What figure did they come up with? How many of the researchers in the food industry are actually doing what might be called socially useful work? 4% is the figure they came up with. So 96 out of 100 researchers in the food industry are just cloning competitors' products, basically, doing little more than that. The more you look, and it's something I don't think we in the Socialist Party have probably done enough of, but the more you look, the more you just realise just how much waste there is inside capitalism. We'll strip out the lawyers, obviously. We might want a few of them to stay to help with dispute resolution and such like, but law is 90% property. So I think we'd get rid of most of the lawyers. What about all the people handling or counting money, from the shop assistant to the security guards, taking the money away, the banks processing it, all the company salary clerks, all the credit control departments, all the people working for inland revenues, the VAT departments, and then all the people in the financial sector, the life insurance, the pensions industry, and then the City of London, which we are, I'm pleased to say, we're within spitting distance here, and I understand it. How would socialism cope without the bond traders and the hedge funds and the derivatives dealers and so on? And then there's the less obvious activities, perhaps. Advertising, marketing, sales, the brand consultant that I quoted from earlier. Go and do something more useful. Do we need all this advertising? Does anyone really need to tell you that if you need food, you can go to a supermarket? Does anyone need to tell you that if you want to drink a beer, you go to a pub? I don't think so. I always find it funny in Scotland, in October every year, they have a week, Scottish Pub Week, a festival to encourage the people of Scotland to leave the sports centres and to leave their house and don't talk to their family. No, get out of the house, go to your local pub, try and find it, might be hard, and sample the fare in there. You don't need to encourage people to do this, they do it anyway. Another industry, what about the media? Well, there's still a lot of entertainment and information and news and all that, but increasingly a large proportion of the media sector is, to all intents and purposes, part of the advertising sector. You take your average newspaper, if you cut out the adverts, there's not a lot left afterwards. And what would be the spin-offs from this? As I say, it all adds up. If there's no advertising in your local newspaper, that means less paper getting produced, less paper mill workers needing to do that job, less ink needed for the advertising, less work for the chemical industry to provide that. What about the packaging and printing industry? Some of it is useful, sure, but a lot of it isn't. You need some packaging for food hygiene reasons, health and safety, fire protection, that sort of thing. But a large proportion of this product is nothing more than advertising. And if less people are having to work or are working fewer days, that means fewer cars needed for the daily commute. Currently, for every 20 cars in Britain, only one is being used at any time. 19 are just parked there. We live in one big car park. With reduced car usage, that will presumably mean less requirement for car production, for garaging services, and so on. It multiplies up and multiplies up. I could go on, and I'm sure you realise that. But instead of me going on, a useful thing to do is just think about your own job, or the last job you had, and think about how socially useful that job was. Glenn talked about being a tree surgeon. And most people, as he said, will think, oh, what a great job. How useful, practical, working with nature. But as he's saying, there's all these bits of it that actually mean you're not doing your job properly. And it's frustrating. I'm in exactly the same boat. I'm an environmental consultant, which people say, oh, that's great, that's great, you do all that work for the environment. That means you just go out to companies and tell them how little they need to do to stay within the regulations. And this was brought home to me at a job I did. One of my first jobs I did actually, I was told to go out to this factory. I was a bit wet behind the ears. Go out to this factory We've got a problem, some of the workers on the process line have got a problem with dermatitis, skin complaints. So I went out and talked with the supervisors and people there, looked at the chemicals they were handling and talked with them about this process and looked at their handling techniques and detection and all this. And I was speaking with one of the women and just saying, from my report, my notes, I just need to know exactly what you're doing. And she said, well, I'm taking this diode and I'm gluing it with this resin. And that was the problem, the resin. And I'm gluing it on this big shield here. And it's all right, okay. And there's hundreds of these diodes in this big shield. And all right, okay. And what's the big shield? What's that? Oh, that's the warhead, she says. So I'm thinking, my job's a socially useful job, health and safety at work. These people are building a bloody nuclear warhead. You know, when that lands, it's not dermatitis that you're going to be worried about. Again, another example that when you look at your own job, you may think it's a very socially useful job, but the more you realise that there's all these bits to it that actually would not be needed inside a capitalist, inside a socialist society. And I haven't even started to sort of include planned obsolescence, problems with products, planned obsolescence or duplication of work inside capitalism. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm not arguing that consumption inside socialism will change. It obviously will, but I'm not saying that consumption will change. The description I've just had there about the jobs that we would take out, that's not assuming that we would wear sackcloth and ashes, that our consumption levels would change at all. All I'm saying is that the production processes necessary may change, and we'd be stripping out the unnecessary parts of production. It all adds up. One group who have done a study for a modern capitalist nation, Germany, came up with a sort of figure as to how much work in a modern capitalist nation is socially redundant. And the name of this group is 4 Stunden Woche. For those of you who can understand my German, that means 4-hour week. Which kind of gives the answer away. Their assessment was that when you strip out all the socially unnecessary work, your average working week, averaged out for everyone else, would be 4 hours per week. Now, in France, they try and add on half an hour on the working week in France, they have a riot. So, you know, how appealing is this? That's a bit of a vote catcher, that one surely, a 4-hour working week. Now, I'm not saying for a second that socialism would be a 4-hour working week. I just think that the more we look at it, the more we scratch the surface, the more we realise just how much of the structural waste there is inside capitalism. And I'm just going to, a couple of minutes, conclude. I think there's 4 caveats I want to make to what I've just said there. First of all, it can't be assumed that a reduction, say, in labour by 50%, for example, would correspond to a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions. But I suspect it wouldn't be far off that. I think the two would correlate fairly well. Obviously, not all jobs have a similar CO2 footprint, but I think the correlation would be fairly similar. Secondly, my discussion there is of relevance to developed capitalist nations, of course, and it is of lesser relevance to developing nations. And for some parts of the world, it is of no relevance. That there's not many credit controllers in the Sudan, I suspect. But nonetheless, I do think that when you actually look at the whole sum, when you add it up, because the vast majority of CO2 emissions are coming from the developed nations, if we're able to strip out all this unproductive activity, socially useless activity, it would make an immense difference to the global CO2 contributions. Third caveat I want to make is that ties in with that. Of course, socialism would be accompanied, in fact, would be driven by a significant expectation of immediate improvements in living conditions and nutritional requirements of some 2/3 of the world's population, and that's an issue that I'm not claiming to have factored in here at all. That's a big issue in its own right, how that development could be matched against reductions inside socialism. And I'm certainly not saying that reduction inside socialism can continue in a non-renewable fashion. Socialism will need to utilise non-carbon technology in much the way as capitalism is slowly trying to do now. But really just to, I think, finish up here, there's lots more I could say, but I've spoken enough, I think. What is it that's so frightening for the capitalist class about global warming? According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've tried to calculate the global gross domestic product, how much will it need to reduce by year on year for the next 30 years in order to slow down CO2 emissions, plateau them out, and then sometime later, because there is a latency period, sometime later we'll see the CO2 emissions actually start dropping. What is the sort of reduction in GDP that would be necessary? What is it that has the boardrooms and the corporate sector quaking in fear? Well, it amounts to that, apparently. 0.12% reduction in GDP year on year over 30 years. That's what they cannot live with, because that means recession. Because capitalism is geared to growth. Now, just to put this into context, that's a little over 1,000th of a reduction. That's equivalent to you knocking off from your work every day early by about 30 seconds out of your 8-hour day. You add that up over 30 years and you end up knocking off maybe at 5:45 rather than 5 o'clock. So that wouldn't cause me any problems. It seems to be causing the capitalist class immense problems. In summary, you'll be glad to hear, capitalism is intellectually bankrupt. Remember Sir Nicholas Stern's profound difficulties? It's a society that once was revolutionary, but it's now decadent. 5 blades on your sharing experience. It's increased our ability to produce wealth, no doubting that, but now has simply no handle on what to do with it. It just can't get the wealth to those who actually need it. It's creating more and more stuff, but production is less and less the solution, and more appears to be becoming part of the problem. Capitalism has served its function. We're fiddling while Rome burns, we're producing while the globe warms. On the one hand, it's trying belatedly to address global warming issues, but on the other hand, it's still trying to pump more stuff into us. As time now is starting to run out, and for some societies, as Glenn mentioned, some communities, it's becoming critical. Capitalism then is a society that is well past its sell-by date. Thanks.
I was taught when I did school certificate in 1942 that the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was 0.02%. It's now 0.03%. That is a 50% increase. Looking at the various temperature changes, there are a whole series of thermal changes that have taken place in the past several billion years. And if you, in fact, interpret that, for example, Somerset and New Codorniu laid down in a hot desert condition, Devon, the old red sandstone, ditto. And you plot those temperatures on a log basis, you get a whole series of sequences. And the point is, at what point now are these temperature changes overseeing the basic normal geological changes? And I think they are very impressive. What is a fact is the effect, not the temperature, but the effect of temperature. In other words, you get it down by melting ice caps, and which is what is happening, and the change of glaciers. So that is, for me, a question of fact. What is the question is really also is of pollution, which is that we're generating CO2, and the large problem for the world is to reduce the generation. There's enough oil, of course, but we don't want to do that. There's enough oil in the in the Rockall Trench, which is near the island of Rockall under seas, which is why Thatcher put the flag up on Rockall about 2 years before it was announced. Ditto, off Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, there are oil in the sea. Ditto, the South Atlantic, oil is accessible. They're accessible once oil gets to about $2, $100 a barrel. In other words, this is a question of effort if required. It is a profit generated at present, so it won't happen. It's a social, under a proper society, a social society, it should not happen. There are alternatives to energy. There are a lot of blue skies now. With the Institute of Engineering and Technology, the stuff coming up. Looking, for example, if you take water out of a river and some water out of the sea, you put a membrane between them, as an osmotic pressure develops. There's an energy source there. There's a lot of water coming out of the rivers, there's a lot of sea there. These are energy to looking to see if they can make engine. With refrigeration problems. You can in fact make solid state. They're working on solid state refrigeration, merely by changing the magnetic orientation within an atom or molecule, and this gives you a different behaviour, which in fact absorbs energy here or gives it up there. So you've got basic refrigeration. A hell of a lot of stuff is around, it's possible. It will not happen under capitalism. And I was joined the Socialist Party, Great Britain, in '43, and still believe, that socialism was possible and essential. As a result of that, I became a veteran boy and got one of these badges 60 years later. And having gone down, it was hot. I did that 3 years because I really believed that socialism was possible, and I'm bloody annoyed that none of you have managed to do it yet, not I. And this is because I thought it was real. I still do think it's possible. I think it's essential. So that was already what I was doing 3 years. But when I went down there were old, or not so old miners working away. They were still there when I left. They were driven there, not by Mr. Bevin, but by poverty. And the only way we can get around that is to change society and stop and find alternative ways of generating energy and stop delivering CO2. I think also, for example, the attitude to the personal car. When I was a little boy before the war, you stand on the arterial road and every 20 minutes a car would come past, you know. And now we have another 10-minute cars more than we need.
Could I
Yes?
just stop you there?
Thank you.
Yeah.
How important it is to do it, and the incentive is not there under capitalism, only under socialism.
Right.
Not in a kayak going through the Northwest Passage. I think we discussed this out on hour in our tent, and there was a huge Coast Guard presence of the Canadians, which hasn't been there before. And also there's a strange thing about, I don't know the legalities of this, but if you there are, if you like, territorial waters around most continents and countries. And Canada has a kind of strange situation because, as you know, it's an archipelago of many, many islands. And America is saying, well, actually, it only goes, just slightly north. We can go where we want the Northwest Passage. And indeed, I think it was the Manhattan years ago, a big icebreaker that they sent through the Northwest Passage just to sort of puff their feathers up, this is the Americans, and say, we have rights through this place. So I think in answer to your question, it wouldn't surprise me at all. You're absolutely right, Russia did stake a bit of a claim in the North Pole. The Alberta tar sands, America's just paid Canada for access to the Alberta tar sands. It takes about 6 barrels of perfectly good, clean, fresh water to make 1 barrel of oil out of the Alberta tar sands. I don't know whether America will go to war with Canada, but they are really at loggerheads at the moment over these territorial rights around this big archipelago of islands. Does Canada extend right north of Baffin and so on, or does it just then extend into that little bit of the Northwest Passage? There may well be, and I think when things get nasty, I mean, America's already shown its colours in terms of oil, hasn't it? I mean, if it wants oil, it'll go and kill people. I think quite possible. I don't know about Canada, though. I think it would be a serious state if they declare war on Canada.
Right. Last winter being the coldest winter, well, the questioner may have missed the point that it's only winter one half of the globe. I'm in contact on a discussion forum with a couple of people living in Australia, and they mentioned casually in passing that they've had the hottest summer in recorded history, and they've currently got the worst drought that has occurred in Australia since Captain Cook discovered Botany Bay. So the thing is, global warming is a general trend. It's not. It doesn't preclude colder patches. It's the trend that you follow. It's a bit like unemployment since the war. It's always gone down and up and down and up. But each peak has always been higher than the last one. So the trend in unemployment is up. So it is with global warming. The question I'd like to put to both speakers is concerning energy production. Harry used the words fuels, emissions, and pollutants, and sort of conflated the whole thing. These are separate things that ought to be not to be bundled together as if they're the same thing. Bearing in mind that if we achieve socialism, we'll need to raise the living standards of what is now called the undeveloped world, the third world. How do the speakers see us doing that without contributing to global warming by burning fossil fuels? And the suggestion is being that, and I think it's the right one, is that burning fossil fuel and generating electricity are the two main contributors to CO2 and global warming. What possible alternatives are there for energy production which will be needed to raise living standards to what might be called an acceptable, or thought of as an acceptable standard?
Yeah, I touched on it briefly, that a lot of what I said there, I couldn't claim to be, it was, I think, relevant to mature capitalist states, but less relevant to developing nations. I think it's a very important point. In fact, the Socialist Party has touched on this previously. The pamphlet we produced on production for use, socialism as a practical alternative, where we outlined how socialism, when it comes to pass, if it comes to pass, it would have to ramp up production, food production, massively to feed the starving millions, as it were. And I suppose, this is a subject for discussion. I suppose my feeling is that that's maybe not particularly a realistic view necessarily. I don't take the view that we're going to need to massively ramp up production. We're just going to need to sort of divert it a little bit. As we know, there's super tankers coming from Africa over to Europe with lots of you get Kenyan green beans in January, which I think the Kenyans probably need more than we do. So, looking at food, I think, and I know this is an idea that's come from the Green Movement, localisation, the antithesis of globalisation. I think there's a lot in there that is of interest to socialists, that we would have to sort of wind the clock back a little bit. And that graph that we had earlier on is looking at CO2 emissions since the over the last few centuries, and how they've ramped up since the mid-70s. Well, one thing that has ramped up is transportation. Global transportation has ramped up absolutely massively. The question was more specifically on energy, however. but I suppose my point there was that, put it this way, the working class in Britain have been bought off by capitalism for the last century or so, since they got the franchise, since the idea of socialism came around, and been bought off by increased living standards. But the increased living standards have been fairly gentle over a period of time. If your parents have an outside toilet, but you have an inside toilet, and your children have central heating, then over the course of a couple of generations, you're seeing this gradual improvement. So I don't think that we need the third world to suddenly all have a swimming pool in the backyard like some workers have in America, although their houses may now be repossessed. I just don't think that's a very realistic situation. I'm inferring that if your expected mortality age is in the mid-30s or something like that, then you'd be quite glad to be living a few decades more. You're not needing that level of standard of living immediately. You just need to see the planet doing everything it can to equilibrate. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of the scenarios that they allow for there is that they're expecting that around the world everybody's going to have the same standard of living of the mature nations, the mature capitalist nations. So that's quite an assumption that they make there as well. But certainly in terms of energy production, there are these technologies that are going around. It's hard for them to actually get to a critical mass because the larger you are, particularly with energy and energy efficiency, the larger you are, the more efficient it is usually. And then what happens is the price comes down. And we've heard price, a very good point made by a question earlier on about the price when a barrel of oil hits $100 a barrel, then suddenly all these oil fields that were uneconomic suddenly become economic. In fact, my last point on this, Glenn wants to get in, is that I was reading last week that they're opening coal mines in Britain again. We thought that was a dying industry. With a lot of talk about the Bevan boys mentioned this afternoon. Well, they're opening the coal mines again simply because the price of oil has gone up so high that it now makes it economic to start pulling this dirty fuel back out of the ground again. And this is the logic of capitalism. On one hand, they're saying, we've got to deal with global warming. But on the other hand, they're saying, but that's cheap. I fancy some of that. This is the problem that we have.
I would agree with that. Also, my understanding of the situation at the moment is the big oil companies are doing their absolute best to suppress other forms of energy because it's not really in their interest to have other forms of energy that's going to disrupt their business activities. And I think that goes about, it's a thing that's gone on for ages anyway, that sort of thing. Also, you talk about Africa's often held up, and rightly so. In sub-Saharan Africa, thousands of children are dying, and I've mentioned that myself, and I find that extremely hard to conceive. I don't know how it's as if, a mother's not likely to grieve any less in Africa with a dying child than she would in this country, yet it seems to be accepted as something of that's just what Africa's like, pretty much as the summer, holiday, spring. But I would say on the issue of poverty, I've just read a bit of research today as I was coming up, funny enough, that equates consumption of goods with happiness, and we plateaued out now. So the amount of things we consume is now being shown actually by research not to make us any happier. So I don't think one can equate the acquisition of more and more things and with happiness. However, of course, it would be quite wrong to say that we expect Africans to be sort of smiling next to their huts regardless. Of course, one would expect them to have a much better lifestyle. On the subject of food consumption, which you mentioned, I also read today, and this is backed up by research, that the cost to America at the moment is billions of dollars in dealing with Americans spending money on things like liposuction, appetite suppressants, dietary supplements, all these things to try and deal with their weight. The actual cost could pay, on balance, for the food needed for the sub-Saharan Africa. So, leaving aside the fact that we actually throw away 30% of the food we buy and buy 30% more than we need. So we buy 30% more than we need and we throw 30% of it away. Leaving that aside, as I say, the Americans on their liposuction and everything else, if they save that money, they could feed the people that need feeding. The other thing, of course, I made a quick note here is that about this lifestyle thing you kind of allude to, where people all want something better. I read somewhere that you don't need to advertise food to a hungry man, but most of us are sold commodities on the basis of advertising. We're constantly being persuaded that we need things that we actually don't really need. And even now, companies are desperate to get laptops into Africa so they can persuade them they need, various things like Coca-Cola or iPods or whatever it is, because it makes sense to try and sell these people these things. But what I'm saying is we don't really need as much, I don't think, as we can't be led to believe